Warning: today's episode of Crimson and Motive contains direct quotes from video evidence used at trial. The content is highly graphic in nature. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Welcome to the Crimson and Motive podcast. I'm your host, Alexandra. Join me as we explore the dark, twisted stories of murder, serial killers, and the demented. Hello, everyone. Thank you again for joining me on today's episode of Crimson and Motive. If you haven't already, please subscribe to my Facebook page at Crimson and Motive, where I will be discussing future episodes and open forums on past episodes. I posted a hint on my Facebook page regarding what this episode would be about, and it was highly requested. I debated whether I would do this episode because it is so highly publicized, and I wanted to give it justice. But now that not only do I have Canadian listeners, but also international listeners as well, I felt it would be interesting to talk about. So, without further ado, let's talk about the Ken and Barbie Killers. This is a fascinating case to discuss because if you ask any Canadian who the most hated woman in Canadian history is, they will likely say Carla Homoka, one half of the murderous couple that went on a serial killing spree with her husband, Paul Bernardo. I am very excited to discuss today's case because I personally feel like the story has been completely whitewashed and that not all of the interesting facts associated with this case are ever brought up. While doing my research, I discovered much more information to discuss and am excited to give you excerpts of these discoveries. So let's get this started and start from the very beginning. On August 27, 1964, Paul Bernardo was born the youngest of 3 children in Scarborough, Ontario, to a highly abusive household. His father was charged with child molestation in 1975 that included Paul's sister, and his mother would sequester herself to the basement and be verbally abusive. At the age of 16, his mother informed him that Paul was the product of an extramarital affair and that the person he believed was his father was not his father biologically. Despite this, he appeared to be a bright, handsome kid, was a lifeguard, and volunteered for Boy Scouts. Nonetheless, there was a darker side to him. Following in his father's footsteps, it was around this time that Paul would start peeking into his female neighbors' windows while they were undressing. After high school, Paul started studying to become an accountant at the University of Toronto Scarborough campus. He was over 6 feet tall with charming good looks. He appeared normal to his friends, but experts like Dr. Fred Berlin state that consented sex was not something that would arouse Paul. He dated several women who all would leave after the relationship would turn abusive. He fantasized about raping women, and this fantasy would turn to reality by 1987 at the age of 23. He would attack women from behind after they would get off at a bus station or walk through a park, drag them to secluded areas, and rape them. His acts were especially sinister as he would beat them, force them to say horrible, degrading names like they were sluts, and after he raped them, he would find sticks or other objects and insert them into his victims. After some women felt like he left and would conjure up courage to leave, he surprised them, dragged them back, and repeated the process repeatedly. Because the women were attacked from behind, they would never identify Paul any more than saying he was blonde and good-looking. Thus, the community would be in fear of the Scarborough rapist. On October 17, 1987, his life would change in a hotel restaurant. He would meet a 17-year-old girl who was in Scarborough for a pet food conference, and within hours they would have sex in her hotel room. That girl was Carla Homoka. Karla was the eldest of 3 daughters and was raised in St. Catharines, Ontario. Her father was a vendor of lamps at flea markets, and her mother was an administrative assistant at a local hospital. Karla was beautiful, blonde, and popular, and was obsessed with Disney princesses. But during her teenage years, she would enter a dark phase of wearing all black. Nonetheless, this phase would eventually go away, except for the obsession with death. After the household pet passed away, she convinced her friend to help her dig up the body just to see what it would look like. Paul and Karla's relationship grew as he visited her several times a week and would shower her with gifts. By 1989, she had graduated from high school. Paul would become verbally abusive, but she would forgive him quickly. Then one day, on a romantic trip to Niagara Falls, Paul would propose to Karla, and she accepted. But while this was going on, the Scarborough rapist was still on the prowl, and a task force was created to catch the serial rapist. They took upwards of 100 DNA samples of potential suspects, but since DNA was reasonably new at the time, it would take more extended periods for the results to come back. However, a break in the case would happen on May 29, 1990. Paul made a colossal error. He attacked a woman from the front, and she would be able to identify him to a police sketch artist. This composite sketch bore a strikingly similar resemblance to Paul, so much that his horrified friends called into the police station. When Paul was called in, he was calm, relaxed, collected, and willfully offered the police a DNA sample. Unfortunately, he was cocky and arrogant, and that sample would be put in a pile with the others and not processed for another 2 years. FBI profiler Greg McCrary, a consultant for the task force, stated that this rapist would escalate his crimes, and later that year, he would be right. While trying to find a place of their own, Paul and Karla stayed with her parents in St. Catharines. Subsequently, the Scarborough rapist would stop, but sex crimes would increase in St. Catharines. Although there was a considerable age difference between Karla and Paul, her family accepted him with open arms, so much so that her youngest sister, 15-year-old Tammy, saw him as the big brother she never had. However, the feeling was not mutual. No doubt Paul loved her, but in a sick, twisted way. She was still a virgin, Karla wasn't, and he wanted nothing more than to have her. So rather than your typical Christmas present, Karla presented her younger sister Tammy to be raped by Paul. She purchased and stole some animal sedatives from the veterinary clinic she worked at and would slip some sleeping pills in her alcohol after convincing her young sister to join them drinking. After Tammy passed out, they dragged her onto the floor. Karla soaked a rag with halothane to keep Tammy unconscious while Bernardo brutally raped her. This was captured all on video and unbeknownst to the rest of the family, sleeping upstairs. Tammy then begins to vomit and turns blue. The couple immediately clothed her and called 911, but in the early hours of Christmas Eve, Tammy would be pronounced dead. Post-mortem examination discovered a burn mark on Tammy's face from the halothane rag, but police buy into the story that Paul and Karla gave, which it was a rug burn. The police and the rest of the family would conclude that this was an accidental teen drinking gone horribly wrong, and the death was officially ruled an accident. A month later, Paul and Karla moved out of her parents' home and moved into a 2-bedroom bungalow in Port Dalhousie. Within 6 months after Tammy's death, Karla complained that she was not receiving the attention she so desired for her upcoming nuptials with Paul. She felt like 6 months of grieving was long enough. Nonetheless, on June 29, 1991, Karla and Paul were wed at a church in Niagara-on-the-Lake. It was the fairy tale wedding of her dreams that was fitted with a horse-drawn carriage. However, On this day, the police made a grueling discovery in a recreational area near St. Catharines. Fishermen discovered blocks of concrete submerged in the water in Lake Gibson, with various body parts protruding from the cracks. The remains were later identified to be those of 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey, that was missing for 2 weeks. Leslie came from a strict household, and after spending time in the evening with a few friends that were mourning the loss of a fellow student on June 15, 1991, she came home after curfew. She accidentally forgot her key, and the rule was her parents would lock the door after curfew. Standing outside her home, she is approached by a man in a car. It was Paul Bernardo, and he lured her with a cigarette. He then abducts her and takes her back to his house. Karla wakes up to see that Paul and Leslie are drinking out of champagne flutes for their wedding, something that makes her enraged. Not enough, though, to stop what is about to happen. They decide to keep Leslie as a sex slave and videotape brutal assaults and rapes. Less than 24 hours later, he strangled Leslie to death, cut up her body, and laid her in 8 concrete blocks to be dumped in Lake Gibson. Between 1991 and 1992, the Homolka Bernardo household was hostile. Paul continued to stalk women with Karla's knowledge, and abuse begins to turn to Karla as he repeatedly tells her that he's the Scarborough rapist. They also entice several young girls to their home, and using the same MO they used during Tammy's death, they drug these young girls, rape them, but they all managed to live without any recollection of an assault taking place. Paul Bernardo was also an aspiring rap artist, writing and recording lyrics like, "Did you ever get caught? No, never. Why? Because I'm a deadly innocent guy." And, "Yo, I'm the cracker rapper, the lady attacker, the coppers think they know me, but the coppers, they can blow me, 'cause I'm the Scarborough raper. That's just the tip of this caper." But the desire to hunt grows strong with this couple, and on April 16, 1992, both Paul and Karla go out hunting for their next victim. They noticed 15-year-old Kristen French walking home from school, so they pulled into a church parking lot and waited for her to walk by. When she does, Karla gets out of the vehicle with a map, pretending to be lost. When Kristen approaches Karla, they put her into the car and drive back to their house. The witnesses see this take place, and the Green Ribbon Task Force puts out an APB on a beige Camaro. Unfortunately, Paul Bernardo drove a gold Nissan, which made the search hopeless. They keep Kristen for approximately 3 days, raping, sodomizing, beating her, all the while videotaping it. At one point, Kristen saw an opportunity to escape. Bernardo went out for food, and she wanted food from a distant place in St. Catharines that would take Bernardo 30 minutes to go to. She begged Karla to let her go during this time, but she wouldn't even pick up the phone to dial 911. After 3 days, she was strangled to death, bathed, and Paul and Karla cut her hair off. She was dumped in a ditch near Burlington. She would not be discovered until April 30th by a man searching for scrap metal. There was turmoil brewing between Paul and Karla, which came to a head in January 1993. Karla had been beaten severely by Paul and was sent to the ER, where they determined that she had 2 black eyes, a broken rib, and severe bruising from a flashlight. This causes her to move out of the Port Dalhousie home. Also around this time, the DNA results came back from the Scarborough rapist investigation, confirming Paul was indeed the perpetrator. Karla confessed everything to her family and hired a lawyer. However, she only agreed to testify against Paul for a reduced sentence. The deal is kept secret and takes place over 3 days between the Port Dalhousie home and a hotel room. She admits during these interviews that tapes confirm all of the crimes committed, but there is a weird attitude coming from her. She is not showing any form of remorse, and is worried about furniture being processed that she wants to give to her middle sister. Nonetheless, the police and Crown prosecutors agree to the deal, and on February 17th, 1993, Paul Bernardo is arrested. On June 28, 1993, Karla appeared in court facing her charges. However, the reporters are allowed in the courtroom but may only report on the charges and sentencing, which is an unusual move for the Canadian justice system. Her sentence handed down was 12 years in prison after being convicted of 2 counts of manslaughter to be served concurrently. At the same time, Karla files for divorce from Paul. Paul Bernardo would not be put on trial until May 18, 1995, and pleaded not guilty on all 9 charges, including kidnapping, unlawful confinement, aggravated sexual assault, and murder. After 71 days of searching the home, they could not find the tapes that Karla was alluding to. It was not until before trial that the police uncovered them, and it was entirely further from the truth that Karla led investigators to believe. They discovered that she played an equal role in all 3 murders. Had the tapes been found when discussing this deal, her deal may not have happened. The recordings were played in court. Only the jury could see the footage, and the rest of the gallery could hear the audio, which I warn you is horrendous. Warning: I will now be reading excerpts from the transcripts of video evidence. Please fast forward if they are too graphic for you. I will let you know what time to fast forward to. I will not say everything they said to each other because it is alarming, and even I had a hard time typing this up in my notes. If you would like to read the whole transcript, the transcript can be found in Nick Prawn's book, Lethal Marriage. I will now begin to read the excerpt from this book. The following is part of the transcript known as the Fireside Chat that was taped shortly after the death of Tammy Homolka, and it is a conversation between Paul and Karla. I loved it when you fucked my little sister, Homolka said to Bernardo, who was lying on his back beside the roaring hearth, moaning softly while she rubbed his penis. I loved it when you fucked Tammy. I loved it when you took her virginity. They then performed sexual acts on each other. Karla to Paul. Well, we like little girls. I like you to fuck them. If you're going to fuck them, then I'm going to lick them. All the little girls. Paul to Karla. What age should they be? Karla to Paul. 13. Paul to Karla. Why? Karla to Paul. Because it will make you happy. Paul to Karla. But why 13? Karla to Paul. That's a good age. Paul to Karla. Because why? Karla to Paul. Because they'll still be virgins. Paul to Karla. What are you saying? Karla to Paul. I'm saying I think you should fuck them and take their virginity, break their hymens with snuffles, which is what he named his penis. They're all of our children, and I think you should make them ours even more. Paul to Karla. You're right. You're absolutely right. That's a good idea. When did you come up with it? Karla to Paul. Just now. Paul to Karla. You told me something about it before. Is it because Tammy is gone? Karla to Paul. It's the closest thing we can get to her. I would think that's part of the reason, but I also think we should make them ours, said, handing him the bra. He smelt it while she began stroking his penis with the underwear before resuming the fellatio. A few minutes later, when he still hadn't reached a climax, she stopped and continued talking about her dead sister. Karla to Paul. I want to rub Tammy's underwear all over your body. It will make you feel so good. I'm so glad you took her virginity, Paul. Do you remember that? Taking Tammy's virginity in July and then you raped her again in December? Only I was with you this time. Our little virgin. She loved us, you know. I loved it. I didn't give you my virginity, so I gave you Tammy's. I love you enough to do that. I wish we had 4 kids, Paul. Then more sexual acts and discussing another rape they committed in her parents' home. After this, she rubbed his penis for several moments before saying, "I want you to do it again." Paul to Karla, "When?" Karla to Paul, "This summer, because the weather is too bad in winter. If we can do that then, it's good." Paul to Karla, "Good." Karla to Paul, "If you want to do it 50 more times, we can do it 50 more times. If you want to do it every weekend, we can do it every weekend, whenever we can, because I love you, because you're the king, because you deserve it." At this point, more sexual talk happens, and then Karla to Paul, "Yes, I'll go in the car with you if you want, if you think that's best, or I'll stay here and clean up afterwards like I did on Sunday. I'll do everything I can because I want you to be happy, because you're the king. I've got another surprise for you, too. There is someone upstairs, someone awaiting you." There is more sexual talk, and then they proceed upstairs to Tammy's bedroom. Paul to Karla, "Here's my baby's room." Karla to Paul, "Tammy Lynn Homolka's room." Footage of Tammy's waterbed, rag dolls lying on pillows, and her closet still full of clothes. Paul to Karla, "Think of Tammy. I'd look at her outside this window. She was in the pool. Of course the blind was broken, thanks to moi, so I could watch her change. This girl's too much. My little virgin girl. There's her closet and her typewriter and the mirror she used to change in, and her waterbed." A frame-size school picture of Tammy and two smaller photos appear before the lens. Paul to Karla, "Okay, there's my baby, right there. Focus here. Focus right. There she is." Another picture of Tammy is shown. Paul to Karla, "This is my little virgin there, Car. I loved her so much, so nice and warm. Hi, Tammy." Bernardo lies on the bed naked. Karla appears from the right side of the camera, dressed in a black blouse and gray skirt, and hovers above him. She is pretending to be Tammy. Karla to Paul, "I am your little virgin. I'm glad Karla doesn't know about us. She'll never know." Karla continues her dialogue, mimicking Tammy's voice and asking Bernardo if Karla suspects he took her virginity. While she performs various sex acts, Bernardo has a bored look on his face, looking at the ceiling or at photos of Tammy. Karla to Paul, "Tell me you love me." Paul to Karla, "I love you, Tammy." He appears to orgasm, saying, "Oh, Tammy, I love you." Karla to Paul, "I love you, Paul." Bernardo gets up and moves to the camera without acknowledging Homolka at his feet. As Karla looks past Bernardo into the lens, she smiles and waves at the camera. And this concludes the video transcripts. During trial, Karla swore she suffered battered wife syndrome when confronted on the stand, but no one in Canada was buying it. So the prosecution decided not to push for a reversal of the deal. And like that, Carla Homoka became the most hated woman in Canadian history. On September 1st, 1995, Paul Bernardo was found guilty on all counts and was sentenced to life in prison with the opportunity for parole after 25 years. However, because the courts determined him to be a dangerous offender, it is unlikely he will ever be let out of prison. After the trial, the Ontario court released the result of a 6-month inquiry into the practices of the local police forces during the Bernardo investigation. They concluded that many errors resulted in Bernardo falling through the cracks because of his frequent moving. They then implemented a system that increased communication between local police forces regarding serial predators. On July 4th, 2005, Carla Homoka was released from prison, and immediately 2 hours later she sat down with Radio Canada and conducted an interview in French because she felt it wasn't as sensational compared to English news sources. As well, she wanted to restart her life in French society. She claims that she's not a danger to society, and in her belief, she was a model prisoner and was a peer. She also felt that legally she did her time, but emotionally and socially she did not. But in her interview, she shows no tears. She does not apologize to the victims' families, and she denies initiating anything. She just did what she did. It was also reported that during her time in prison, she was in a relationship with a man named Jean-Paul Gerbert, who was convicted of killing his wife. On June 7, 2007, at 2:05 p.m., police conduct a follow-up interview with Paul Bernardo, now known as Paul Jason Teal, regarding his admission of more sexual assaults through a letter he submitted to the Attorney General. In this interview, he gets mad over being accused of being a liar and that he made mistakes 17 years ago. I mean, forgetting to buy milk at the grocery store is a mistake. Telling your wife that the dress she's wearing doesn't look good on her is a mistake. But murdering 3 young girls and assaulting countless others is not a mistake. Conversely, now known as Leanne Teal, Carla Homoka moved to Montreal with her husband and her 3 children. She sparked criticism in her community between 2016 and 2017 when she volunteered at one of her children's schools without getting a background check per Quebec legislation. When the people in her community discovered who she was, they wanted her to leave. This proves that this case will never fade away for the Canadian people. Now again, I find this philosophical analysis interesting and is strikingly similar to my first case on the sex slave murders, which if you haven't checked it out yet, please do. And that is the nature versus nurture debate. Like the other case, Paul Bernardo was raised in a troubled home and followed in his father's footsteps in committing horrible crimes. Like I said last week, Dr. Harold Schechter states that when someone lives in a constant state of psychological abuse, their views of the world are more malignant, and that they will seek to inflict torture as a means of revenge for their terrible childhood environments. In most extreme cases, they only feel alive when committing heinous acts. This makes sense, as even with the video evidence shown at trial, Paul could not climax until he was reliving raping Tammy Homolka all over again and is further proven for his desires for virgins. Regarding the nature element, Karla wasn't as intelligent as Charlene Gallego, but she still had good grades and came from a suburban society. Yet she was fascinated with death at a young age and committed atrocious acts alongside Paul Bernardo. This makes me believe that she is also an excellent candidate to prove that humans can be born inherently bad. But I have some significant problems with this case. First, in her 2005 interview, Karla stated that her family still loves her and visits her even though they may hate what she did. I actually believe this. I have a hard time believing that they would be so fast asleep while horrendous acts are being committed in their living room, and they just think that it was some sort of accident with teen drinking. I just don't buy that story. If it were me, I would be asking some serious questions to the adults that were supposed to be looking after her, wondering why they gave her so much alcohol, if drugs were involved, and I would be requesting a full toxicology screening, and so forth. Paul and Karla's story is egregious to begin with, so even hearing it back then, if I were there, would have me asking some serious questions. Another thing I find unsettling is how the police and Crown prosecutors handled the Homolka deal. I mean, they were dealing with an admitted criminal, and there was no clause in there at all that stated if something worse came about, the deal would be off. They no longer just had circumstantial evidence, and they should have waited until police discovered the tapes to make the deal. Some defense attorneys claim that, whether society likes it or not, she did her time. But did she really? This deal allowed a convicted serial killer to walk the streets after only serving 12 years, which is unheard of. Lastly, I would like to know if you find it just as strange as I do that both Karla and Paul changed their legal last names to Teal, and this was done after the horrendous acts and the divorce. I would love to know what you think, so please send me an email at crimsonandmotive, that's AND, at gmail.com, or on Facebook at Crimson and Motive, and let me know what you think. Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode, everyone. I hope I did this case justice. See you next Friday for another amazing episode of Crimson and Motive. Take care.